So while Mariana is finding David, there you are, tucked around the corner. So a couple of things that I just picked up on with Mariana is that, like, the lesson here is that we as a social impact group of individuals or ecosystem, we work together. We work together to better the entire ecosystem. So if we want to be considered a sector, we share things, right? Where it's all about sharing, and there's nothing from Josh and I to share things, and Mary Lynn and everybody else. And that's what's really unique about us, is that we do share for the betterment of everybody. So it's the creation of that narrative that we need to really work on, so that other people see the value of us as well. So I wanted to throw that in there. So I am now going to introduce David in a minute. I have no jokes to tell. Can't even remember them. Here we go. Hello. How are you? So while he's getting his laptop sorted out, David LePage, who I am delighted is on in our Fair Province today, is the managing partner of BiSocial Canada. And BiSocial Canada is a network of partners across Canada which advocates for and promotes supportive public policy, environment, and practices, and the practice of leveraging community value from existing procurement. Smart Ice, we are a certified social enterprise and registered with BiSocial Canada, and we're really proud of that. And if you're not, and you are with a social enterprise in this province, you should think about becoming certified. There's a little plug for you, David. David is engaged with social enterprises in multiple roles. He was the designer and initial executive director of the Community Impact Real Estate in Vancouver's inner city, and a founding partner of the Social Enterprise Institute, and he just goes on. And David's got his hands in all kinds of stuff, so we're really glad that you took the time to come here to Newfoundland, which I know he loves coming here, because I think really he loves us, don't you? What? I said you really love coming here because you love us.
I do.
I know you do.
Now you took away my whole presentation.
All right, so over to David when you get all sorted. So welcome.
Great, thank you, Carol. I really do enjoy coming here, and it's really kind of amazing, because I had coffee yesterday morning with Penny Rowe, and we're trying to remember when it was she invited me here to speak for the first time, and it was, she had to go back because neither of us had a memory strong enough to figure out that it was actually in 2007 when the community voluntary sector hosted a conference on the social economy. And it was one of the first presentations that I did on social procurement in a big public event. And it also was fascinating, and I was younger then, and I ran up that hill to whatever it is. I didn't do that this time. But I did run up this little hill this morning. So I'm still doing little hills, not the big hills. And I'm really, really pleased to be here. And it's always great, because having had the opportunity to come back a number of times, every time I come back, I really see the progress of what you're doing in terms of really trying to use the tools and to build community. And let me see so part of where all of this comes from, and we talked yesterday with the group, and some of you have heard this, but for me, where this comes from is really trying to figure out how do we address like some really, really complex issues that communities are dealing with. And I think sometimes we think about those, and they're kind of things that we have to deal with. Like, I'll never forget when I was just out of college, and my first job was working at a neighborhood center in the inner city in a major metropolitan area in the US where I grew up. And it actually was quite fascinating, because I'd grown up in a pretty small community. Some of you, if you follow football, you may have heard of it. I grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. They got these guys named the Packers there. And so some people have heard of Green Bay. we knew it as, when we were growing up there, as a toilet tissue manufacturing center of the world. And it really was. That's where they made toilet paper for the world. And it was like the river near where I lived, you could go down and see what color it was on different colors of the rainbow on a regular basis. Some days it was orange, some days it was bright green, because all the paper mills just put their stuff in there. And so then after I finished college and I started to work, and I was working in kind of a social worker role at a community center, and this young man came in and he said, "Could you help me with this job application?" And I said, "Sure, let's go and sit down and we'll work through it." And I said, what do you need help on? He said, "Well, I can't read." It's an 18-year-old young black man who graduated from high school. I can't read. And then I started to realize, and you see it over and over, and we're working with young men who were part of a gang, the Black Keystone Nation. I'll never forget their name. Major gang in the United States. Some of the brightest young men I ever met. Pee-wee was 18 years old, and his claim to fame was to be the youngest person to ever serve in an adult prison. He also was invited by a professor at the University of Chicago to come down and lecture to his class on the economic conditions of the black man in the United States in 1970. So you start to get an idea, and I'm going, what is all this going on? And all these pieces. And that's when I figured this was not just the pieces. This was really, really something substantive, and this was something that really we had to change in the system. And we look at not only those isolated experiences that I had, but we look at some of the stuff going on. It's like the social isolation, the climate crisis, homelessness, the skills gap. And homelessness, I was looking up, I thought, that's probably not something here in St. John's. So I went on the web this morning and I said, homelessness in St. John's, Newfoundland. And I found out that you're one of the 61 communities in Canada that's part of the counting of homelessness on an annual basis. I'm like, wow, I didn't think that was going to be, and it is. And I travel, not so much during COVID, but I talk to a lot of communities, and homelessness is prevalent everywhere. Communities you never thought of, Prince George, British Columbia. I used to go there years ago, and it was like if you wanted a job, you had a job. And a few people camped out down by the river. Now it's like a phenomenon disaster in the downtown area. I work often and have an office oftentimes in the downtown east side in Vancouver. And it is worse now than when I used to work there on a daily basis 10 years ago. And it was in 2013 when a friend and a colleague came over from the UK, and I took him through the downtown east side, and he said, "Do you actually allow people to live like this?" And it's worse than that now. I was talking to one of the binners. There's a social enterprise, and the binners are the dumpster divers, and they have a social enterprise that they work together. So they'll go into they'll make a contract with MUN, and they go in and they go to the dumpster and they pull out all the cans and bottles that should be recycled so it doesn't go to the landfill, and it actually saves companies money. So they've created this really we're dumpster divers. What do? We save you money diving in your dumpsters. And they get the value, and it was just on their Twitter feed yesterday, they've now paid out more than $1 million to their social enterprise participants. So it's kind of huge, and I was talking to him, and he's lived in the downtown east side a long time, and he's like, this is really bad. I can't find my front door. There's so many people camped on the street. And this is someone who's lived there. So we're seeing it's not improving. We're still trying to address it. The next slide. So I think one of the things that I started to understand is that all of these issues were so tied together, and that the things like the Cuyahoga River in central Ohio in 1967 started to burn because it was cheaper to dump all your effluents into the river than it was to do anything else and process them. So they did it long enough until the river got on fire. Someone said, I think we have an environmental problem here. You know, so we've got these really what I saw as connected problems of the social situation, the economic situation, the environmental situation. And then I started to delve into it and realized that we had an economic system that was so based on transactional outcomes, so based on, as Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, for those of you who were here yesterday, I couldn't remember his name yesterday, I got it today. So he's a what was it, one of those economists, won those big prizes. And he has an interesting book he wrote a couple years ago where he identified for him the problem in economics is money used to be a means of transaction. Like we make deals, right? I give you $1 and I get something back. He said now money no longer is the means of transaction, it's actually become the goal. So the goal is who dies with the highest stack of dollars. And so that's really changed the whole purpose of the marketplace. The marketplace no longer is about a means of building community or sharing wealth. It's about creating personal wealth. And so we've gone and created an economy that's based on transactions that has to extract a value. And so when I started to say, okay, well, how do we shift that? We can go to the next slide. What if we transform the economy? And instead of thinking about getting to just economic value, we actually start to look for community value. We try to create community capital. And community capital isn't just economic capital, but it's human capital. We can't have young men, 18 years old, graduating from high school who can't fill out a job description. We can't, we have to have more impact construction and choices for youth where you actually get a chance. And cultural, we need more of the engagement and the recognition. And we struggle now with terms like reconciliation, and it's really something that should be part of how we create a community and how we create that reconciliation through the economy. And in terms of physical capital, we're starting to pay attention. We're starting to realize that, weather and climate and everything is attached to the economy. And so if we can start to do that, and if we can use it to build social capital, that glue in communities, that's the resilience, that's the relationships. And we were talking yesterday how important, during the COVID period for groups like Stella and others, that the social capital that they had created over the last 30 years really came back as a value, right? Because in COVID, I think all of us took our social capital to the bank to create relationships. And so in a social value marketplace, there's 3 components that I want to spend a couple minutes talking about. One of them is the social value finance. That's sort of the fuel in the economy. The other one is social enterprise, which is really about one of the means we use to build community capital. But it's the supply side in the marketplace, because the marketplace has demand, people who want to buy things, and supply, people who make things. And so social procurement then is the third part of this social value marketplace, because that's the demand side. So the first piece I'm going to talk about is the supply side, social enterprise. And I think this group it's so remarkable, and I think back, and we were talking yesterday, what was it, Stella's opened the catering in the restaurant? 2008. What? 2008. 2008, okay, so the first time I came here, it wasn't open. Now it's been going successfully for 15 years. So it's really, when you think of the progression of what you've done here, it's really quite remarkable that you've grown this. How old is, Because, yeah.
I've been in construction since 10 years old, roughly.
Okay, 10 years old. Anyone else with a social enterprise? Carolyn? 5, okay. 5. Josh?
1 month.
1 month? Okay. Look at the progression. Now, no, this is serious. Like if we go back to 2007, how many social enterprises would we have found in St. John's? Yours?
Nonprofit and social enterprise, so about 4 years for the most recent social enterprise.
Okay. So we would have seen some thrift stores probably, but we wouldn't have seen the kind of maturity and success that's here. So this is really an emerging thing. And when I think about the Social Enterprise World Forum, the first Social Enterprise World Forum was in Scotland in 2008, and I think there were 300 of us. Last month in Australia, there were over 3,000 participants from over 60 countries. So this is a whole movement. And so part of why it's different as a business is because it doesn't look at the financial return of a traditional business, and it doesn't look at the social value of a traditional nonprofit. It actually says, no, these are blended together. We are trying to create a business that has a blended value return on investment. And that's moving not only in the social enterprise world, but it's starting. There's an Italian economic term that sounds more in English like virus. It's called infecting the others. And I think in English it's influence. But I always like it. Infecting. I think social enterprise has infected the entire business world. Because now more and more businesses are saying, how do I do a social value? How do I express my contribution back to the community? Because it isn't just about social enterprises, it's not just about charity, it's about the private sector learning that this is a good way to express and to be in community, and it's also becoming a competitive edge. Because we're working with one construction company right now that came to us and said, we just lost 7 bids last year because we didn't have a social value. And so when we start to think about this, we're starting to see the emergence of social enterprise, we're starting to see hybrid businesses, and we're starting to see social purpose businesses who are being very explicit about it's not something we do like CSR off the side of our desk. I had someone email me recently and said, how do we get rid of United Way as the way to do things in community? Because it's like, that's what we've always done, is give to United. How do we change that to making it part of what we do, not something we do over there, right? And so it's really kind of fascinating to see these transitions. So if we think at the demand side, and that's what you guys are talking about for the next day and a half, is social procurement, that's really about taking that traditional procurement model of I need something and you provide it and we have a financial transaction, to moving it to, very good, Mark, you got this down, to adding a social value into that transaction to make it a transformative event. So the same thing is like when you think about the work that was done, what's the latest impact construction one? First Light, right? Wasn't that a recent one?
Yes.
First. Yeah. So when you think about First Light needing to hire a construction company to do the work that they had to do on their building, instead of just going out and getting the lowest bid, they may have gotten the lowest bid, but they also got the social value. So they got the building done, so they got the value they needed, they got what they needed, the building done, but because they were consciously working with a social enterprise supplier, they then actually created community value. So when you start to think, nobody lost money, nobody gave up value, but everybody in the community gained value. And you think about that, and where we learned about some of this was actually from the environmental side, because until that crisis came, like the Cuyahoga River, and all, eagles were like dying because of lead in the communities. And people started to say, I think it's because we don't pay attention to what we buy. And so there was actually that movement in the 70s and 80s and the 90s that, okay, let's start to have an environmental consideration in what we purchase. And that was a lesson for us when we tried to do social procurement, because we said, okay, all of the procurement side of people could add that in. Why can't we add in social? And of course, there were a lot of issues around doing that, but again, we start to see how it's evolving. And you think about, even in, again, back to what you're doing here, how the province is now looking at a social procurement strategy. So you start to have a whole transition of like, oh, Newfoundland and Labrador as a province has a green purchasing strategy. And now they're saying, oh, we can look at this evolution, and now we can start looking at a social one. And then how do we put social value into that procurement? We start to say, look at how you create value. If you can purchase from a social enterprise, all the money you're spending is being invested in community, because all the profits go back. But there's not a social enterprise to do everything we need. So can we look for a local business? Can we look for an Indigenous-owned business, a women-owned business? And if we can't find it locally, can we at least find it regionally? So we try to start to get people who are buying things to look at, this is not about just an economic transaction. Every purchase has an outcome. It has an economic, it has an environmental, a cultural, and a social impact. Instead of just letting that happen accidentally, we actually start to intentionally create those outcomes when we make decisions on what to buy. And the third piece of the social value marketplace is finance. And so we start to look at, how do we start to create blended value financial tools? Because people are going to invest, and traditionally the investment model was, how much do I get back? When's the initial public offering? What's your exit strategy? And all the things. I have a very good friend who, when we were talking about social investment, and she and I were both sitting on the board of a small progressive social value tech company and having trouble clearly raising money for a social value tech company. And everyone said, oh, tech companies can get all the money they want. Until you tell them your purpose is democracy, not an exit strategy, then they aren't so interested. And so, she turned to me one day and said, all these investors, they're just looking for Google with a halo. And they still want the financial thing, but they want to be able to say, yeah, but it was good, but they still prioritize that financial return. So we need to address that, and we need to start looking, as Jed Emerson talks about, maximizing community benefit. So Jed's one of those people who started working in social enterprise in the 90s. Now he's actually doing financial stuff. So really someone who's led this in a number of ways and is really, really value. Okay, so when we start to talk about what do we need to do to build this marketplace, we've actually started to look at what are the things that are kind of important to have in place. And we think about social enterprise, and there's three key things when we start to look about creating a supportive environment for social enterprise to thrive. And it's the business acumen. I mean, it's the people who have run nonprofits learning about, business. It's the business people who want to come over and help in the charity sector to learn about what a social value is. And so it's really getting the right mix, understanding that blended value. But it's also making sure that social enterprises have access to markets. And that's really been how we've tried to push the social procurement thing. Because it's one thing to have the social enterprises. And when I was working in the downtown east side in the early 2000s, everyone said, let's start more social enterprises. And then they said, That's great, but they can't hire more people unless they do more stuff. They can't hire more people unless there's sales. So, potluck cafe, how do you get more business? Because more business meant more employees, more benefits. And the other one is, how do you get access to appropriate financing? Because when you're a startup social enterprise, you don't, and you're probably owned by a nonprofit or a charity, you don't have equity to sell to investors. And you don't have an exit strategy to sell to them. And so you're kind of like going, oh, I'm going to go to the Business Development Bank because they're a crown corporation and they should be doing this. And I'm like, 20-some years later, still sending letters to the minister saying, so why doesn't a crown corporation make loans to nonprofits? Why don't the big banks who, reported in the last quarter some accumulative $30 billion in profits, invest in social value things? So I'm like, we've got to change and get access to financing. And I think we're starting to learn some things. We're starting to start some small funds, the investment readiness program, the federal money. But to me, I'm like going, why are we creating new money when there's all this money out there that's so much bigger than $755 million of federal money? It's like, you already got billions. Let's use what's out there to do well. I mean, we're learning that with procurement. We're not saying, start buying stuff you don't need because we got a social enterprise that makes it. It's like, okay, let's start a new, no, let's look at what are the financial tools we have. And then we start to look at social procurement. And this is amazing to me, to learn some of the principles that we really need. And collaboration becomes one that's so important, because I see the success of social procurement in communities like St. John's and Newfoundland and Labrador, because there's community working with business, working with government. And we see that in Winnipeg, where this local community economic development corporate, effort is working with the Chamber of Commerce, is working with the construction industry, and they're telling the counselors, you got to do social procurement. And so the counselor's like, okay, we'll do this. It's coming from community. That's what you want. Calgary, probably, one of the places no one would have imagined would have been the leading social procurement designer in Canada. In fact, the first time I met with their head of procurement when we got the contract to do social procurement in Calgary, we looked at each other and said, if we can make this happen in Calgary, it can happen anywhere. And she said, yep. They don't call it social procurement in Calgary. They call it benefit-driven procurement because they couldn't quite wrap their heads around social. But that came from the community. That came from Momentum, which is the community economic development group there, in partnership with the small, green, and progressive business community. And they went to council. Where we've seen it fail is in the communities, in the areas, the municipalities, where community's not part of driving it. And then it just gets to be a discussion. And then there's goals and policy, tactics and measurement. And if we can get those kind of systems created, we can actually have really successful social procurement. And when we get to social finance, it's really about redefining finance, right? We start to think about how can we change finance from just being an economic return on, investment. And everyone thinks about, what happened when they made an investment. And the only measurement is the financial return. No one talks about what jobs were created. No one talks about who got a job. No one talks about the cultural diversity that was created. So we need to start looking at things like patient capital funds that can be created where it's like, you need to open up another Stella's, you need to borrow $100,000, that it's not like, don't start paying tomorrow, pay in 5 years at a GIC, rate or something. There's lots of creative things that people are coming up with. And then we need to start creating equity-like investments where people may want to be equity partners, but it's not really equity, but they get paid based on the success of the business. So as the business grows, as the social enterprise grows, they get some returns, but it's based on the cash value of what's coming, not on some setup of like, I control this. So I see all of this for you guys and as being part of the paradigm shift. And to me, we're moving down this, and do you guys know paradigm shift, the term? There's a scientist, John Kuhn, who came up with this term. And he basically said, at the beginning, before something changes dramatically, somebody kind of discovers it. And then they discover this new idea. And then once they start talking to some other people, they say, oh no, we're fine, we're doing everything well, we don't need to change. But this person who's discovered that has a couple friends, and they say, we like your idea. And then they have a couple friends working on it. And then some more people come, and they're not the discoverers, they're the explorers. And then you get some people exploring the idea, and then you get, in 2008, Stella's. And then in 2015, you get, a construction company. And then in 2017, you get a social enterprise strategy. And then in 2020, you start talking about social procurement. And pretty soon, there's more and more people who are not just exploring, they're now the initial participants. And then it starts to continue to grow. And so paradigm shift is when you start to change the very culture and the very activities of what's driving. And so when I look at this in terms of the social value economy or social value marketplace, we're progressing. When I think of where we started, we've moved so far. I mean, by Social Canada, first 5 years, purpose of our business plan was based on go do missionary work. Try raising money to do missionary work around changing the economy. Sort of like going and saying to a foundation like I do, it's like, you should give away all your money. And they're like, I don't think that's a good idea. And I said, okay. I said, well, invest in social procurement. People are like, what is social procurement? And I'm like, okay, we need to learn. And we need to learn what is social enterprise, what's social finance. And it's taken us a long time. But now we start to look at this and we see more and more engagement. I was running a bit late because I was on a conference call with Infrastructure Canada, trying to advance their community employment benefits, and they're trying to figure it out. And someone recently said to me, like, David, now that Treasury Board changed their policy and public service is going to do social procurement, are you going to quit? And I said, no, those are just the policies. Now we have to implement all that stuff. So we have another 5 to 10 or 20 years. So I'm really counting on you guys, because I don't think I'm going to be here another 10 or 20 years, or you'll be wheeling me in anyway. But it's so great, and I come here and I see the change every time in the progress. And you guys should be so proud. I mean, the coalition you put together to bring this, that whole question of collaboration is so important, those partnerships. That social capital that you're building cannot be replaced. So you guys are showing what a social value marketplace can look like. You're collaborating, you're creating social capital, you're building things like, that are not just structures. You're building things that are building community. And I think that's really, really valuable. So I just want to say thank you, and I want to say congratulations. You should just do a round of applause for everything you've done in the last 15 years from when I first came here. So. I don't know if we have any time, if there's any questions or comments or stories. A couple of minutes.
This is something I think we think about, a lot of us, is we're doing this work in a pretty remote corner of the country in the grand scheme of things, right? We don't do it that way, but lots of other people do. So Just, I guess, thinking about how to get, thank you, Mariana, sorry about that. Just thinking about how to keep or get the work that's happening here on the national radar screen is a question. What are, beyond things like this, and obviously conversations with your shop, but any things, I think even for the individual organizations in here, there's some benefit to building that profile. So I'm curious what you think, what are some good ways to do that?
Well, I think there's a couple, it's a great ambition and a great question, because it's really, really critical to all of us moving this forward. And we were talking about it yesterday on our panel about telling stories. And I think one of the greatest things you can do is start creating your stories and sharing them outside of your remote corner of the country. But don't be afraid to send them to members of parliament. Don't be afraid, and if you send them to people who work at Employment and Social Development Canada, talk to your member of parliament. There's a big event going on tonight and tomorrow on Parliament talking about social finance, right? And so they're being introduced to this idea. There are a lot of public servants in Ottawa who love what we're all doing, but for them, they can write briefing notes. It's really different if they can deliver a 3-minute video that shows someone getting a job, or shows, a former worker at Impact Construction, getting a full-time job in the construction. They've solved a problem, right? Getting someone from Stella's who's got a job, is getting a paycheck, who wasn't last year. Those are the stories, because they get briefing notes all the time. They get all the stats, all the reason, and we were talking about this yesterday, because you can do briefing notes, but you can tell stories. And I think it really becomes important for the coalition to make it one of their purposes, is to promote the stories. Because when your mayor goes to meetings with other mayors, she should have a whole pocket of stories from social enterprises in St. John's. Because they all meet with other people, right? So all your public servants who work here provincially, they're meeting with colleagues from around the country. So if you want to share your story, I would use government public servants as a way. And I would also start to look at how do you participate. And this is a thing that's hard, because it takes time and effort. How do you start to participate in the national dialogue with groups like SEDNet, that has the People-Centered Economy group that meets every month, and they just talk about people-centered economy issues. And it can be a bit of a lot of time and effort, but I don't know how to get out of our own little corners, because it's no different. I mean, there's probably amazing social enterprises in the downtown east side that don't tell their story, and you don't know about them. But you know about potluck because someone's telling their story here. And without the potluck story, you don't have, so that's the stories. And I think it's so important also to start doing and continue to do what you're doing, because when you build this coalition and people start to see it and see the impact of the coalition, you're going to get the phone calls and you're going to get the emails. Like, how did you bring these people together? We can't do it in our community. Or start to do things like participate in community of practices. Like there's a social procurement community of practice. There's all kinds of those things. And just sit down at your coalition table and say, who's connected? And what's the common story we want to tell?
Yeah, and maybe to build off of that a little bit. So I think one of the really exciting untapped pieces in Newfoundland and Labrador is around accessing private investment as well as government investment. And I think that we have an ability or a potential to draw on the sense of community in our province to be able to tap into those private investors. But I'm not sure that we're doing a ton of it right now. So I think about the potential of community bonds, of other more creative forms of investment from the private sector. And I would just love your thoughts on how do we take the next step in tapping into private investment for social good?
I think that's something that we're all experimenting with. We actually just saw a small fund, the Social Value Fund was created by a philanthropist who was tired of seeing business students come out of undergrad and all they knew how to do was financial returns for businesses. So he gave a group of students some money and said, you can invest this, but it has to be in social value businesses. And that now has merged into, and it's on about 5 or 6 campuses. So I think young people are starting to look for better tools than the traditional tools, because they're not going to just sit back and go work on Bay Street and say, this is how I win. And maybe if I work here for 20 years, 80 hours a week, I'll get to be a partner. I don't see that in a lot of people I talk to who are under 30. So I think we're going to be forced to accommodate some of the changing value systems that people bring to the market. And I think that there are now some philanthropists who are looking for not just doing gifting, and to find them and say, look you can get your money back. And it's like, I get my money back? It's like, yeah, you get your money back in 5 years. So, okay, it's sitting in finding things like, and community bonds I think are really, really underutilized. I have to laugh because I used to work in used to manage a community radio station in many years ago. And in the United States, there's like, here there are RSPs. In the United States, there are individual investment things you can do. And I had a board member come to me and he said, I want to give you some money, but I'd like it back. And I said, because he always donated, because we could give him a tax receipt, but he didn't want to give more tax receipted money. He said, can I just like loan you some money? And I'll put it in my investment fund so I don't need it back for like 10 or 20 years. And I said, oh, this is cool. And so the first thing I do is call up a lawyer and a banker and say, can I have lunch? And we had this great lunch. I'd never been in the Madison Club before. It's not the social thing. And they're like, so we go into the Madison Club and I said, here's what I need to figure out. I've got a hunk of money someone wants to give me. I need it to go into a community bond that this person can put into their individual retirement account. And they're like, yeah, it's going to be expensive. And the other guy turned to the banker and said, no, he's not expecting to pay you for this. So we actually created a community bond and raised a whole bunch of money. But it was a one-off kind of thing. And I'm just like, why do we lose these? You know, like the Center for Social Innovation in Toronto did a huge one, and it was asset-backed, kind of. It was like a third or fourth mortgage, so it wasn't kind of. But I mean, and then we didn't see it. So there are some groups working on community bonds, but I think localizing them becomes really a potential tool. And if you can figure out a way to get them into or out of RRSP money, then you've got more time on it, right? Because people getting 2% or 3% right now in your RRSP is better than a negative 7% you're getting in the market. So I think, and some people there's a lot of money right now in certain generations, and we need to be more creative how we use it. And the partnerships between what can you do between like the foundation here who's looking for alternatives and what you're trying to do and some philanthropists, can you get them in a room and say, what can we do? Do you know what I'm saying? Bring the money to the table, bring the opportunity to the table, and just say, there's a big whiteboard. You've got money, we got social value. How do we create an investment tool you're comfortable with, but is not like the one you do all the time? And but I think, you know, that's the social capital, right? So you use the social capital to create financial capital.
Thank you. We've got so much stuff to learn, and I don't mind saying that. David, thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, guys.
There's a couple of things that came out of what I picked up on what you were saying, and some of you are in the room that are really too young to know this campaign, but I worked at the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters years ago, and we had a campaign. It was all about supplier diversity. So I've been working in supplier diversity for about 25 years, and one of them was we made the boots that walk the streets of New York City. And does anybody remember that campaign? I'm getting a few smiles. No. Well, the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters were all about everything being made locally, so it was about local procurement. And I had these same conversations, except it was local procurement versus social procurement, with the procurement people way back when, saying, look, we make boots. We make the safety boots 60 miles from here. And it was about talking with the procurement people at that time about the value of having those jobs within the community, but they weren't calling it social procurement at that time.
Right.
It was all about local procurement and supplier diversity. So not having all your eggs in one basket and having Kodiak from the States provide the boots, but having Terra Nova boots provide them from Harbor Grace. Maybe that might ring a bell. I'm sure, Rob, you might remember that, right? But they had these made here, made right here campaigns, and one of them was, we make the boots that walk the streets of New York City. And I've never, ever forgotten that tagline. But it's the same kind of concept that we've been sort of pushing uphill for years. So that's always stuck with me. We're very curious. You said the word curiosity, right? And we are very, very curious, and we're like a dog with a bone in this room, and we will sort this out, and we will not give up on all the lists of things that we need to learn. So you can come back in 5 years, and we'll bring you in the room. That's no problem, or 10 or 15 or 20 if I know you. The other thing is that the funders need to know what that new blended value means. Because success means different things to different people. So success to Smart Ice means different things to our communities. Josh's community would mean a different success. But typically we're trying to work in that black and white confines of what governments, which are typical funders, say that they have in these policies that are black and white. So we have to educate them as to what some of these other outcomes are. And so that's the narrative and those stories that we create that will hopefully, tug on the sensibilities and heartstrings of people. It was really enlightening, so I really thank you for that. And walking the walk, your treats outside the room are from Crust Bakery, which is a social enterprise owned by Choices for Youth, which hire youth within the community and teach them all about food service. So if you have no other questions, go get your Crust treats. Good.